Hey guys, I thought I'd try something fun and new here. So, I have a lot of people who like to go fishing with me. Unfortunately, I don't have time to take everybody out fishing. But I have a lot of people who also ask me questions too, particularly around my home and river fishing and whatnot. And the unfortunate truth is that not there's not a whole lot of information out there for river fishing, especially in the PNW. And so I'm just going to try making a little video series for my friends to watch, and hopefully some of my friends can enjoy some better fishing this summer. I grew up on a river, actually on two rivers. I was practically a river rat. I would spend 3 to 5 days a week on the river at times, and so I just wanted to share some tips that I've picked up along the way, so that people who ask me for advice can just reference something whenever they need it. So this is going to some of my friends, but I feel like a lot of people in the PNW and anywhere really who wants to watch this could benefit from some, knowledge about river fishing and current and whatnot. So, yeah, here goes nothing. So the first thing we need to talk about is where do the fish like to be in rivers? And particularly in summertime, because that's when most people tend to be out fishing right now, and I think that's when people kind of struggle the most. The big thing is that rivers rivers are hot in summer. Bass need oxygen to survive, and so in a river, um, typically what ends up happening is you have the fish will congregate around areas where the surface of the water is disturbed. It jumps out, grabs oxygen, re enters the river, and so bass really need oxygenated water in order to survive. But they also need to be able to eat without expending too much energy. So typically, bass end up hanging out on um, current breaks. So that could be like a big boulder, that could be an eddy, that could be, bridge pillar, lay down, really anything. A creek running in can be, a great place for them to hang out too. But they need oxygenated water. So typically around like a rapid, creek running in, um, and then they need a place where they can get out of the current. So those two things are really key, because essentially what they'll end up doing is they will stay in that current break in that oxygenated water, and they'll just let the river bring them food. That's it. That's all they do all summer long. And that could be in the form of crawdads, that could be in the form of little sculpin, that could be in the form of little bait fish like pike minnow, uh, you know whitefish maybe not so much, maybe up higher in elevation. um, that could be bluegills on certain rivers, that could be crappie on some rivers, that could be perch. But for the most part, in our neck of the woods, it's crawdads and sculpin and pike minnow, chubs, and that sort of stuff. So they just sit in that current break, wait for the current to bring them food, and then they dart out and grab it. So that is where we find them. You know, so rivers vary greatly in their composition. Where I grew up, it's a lot of chunk rock. It's a lot of fast moving water. It you can drive upstream and you can get into a lot more rapids, and you might be fishing in 12, 15 feet. Or if you go downstream, you can get into like more reservoir kind of stuff. I also got to enjoy, I've gotten to fish other rivers in my life. Some of them are really gravelly and there's not a whole lot to snag on, but where I'm from, it's really easy to lose a lot of stuff. So, my ultimate goal here is to show things, to people that, work really well in a current setting, but also you don't get hung up as easily, and you can catch a lot more and bigger fish too. So that's my ultimate goal, is to share some of this with some of my friends and whoever else wants to listen, and see if maybe I can help you enjoy the rest of summer a little bit more. That's all. Alrighty, so I made a quick diagram, a very rough diagram, so bear with me, to help illustrate this point with summer smallmouth fishing, summer river smallmouth fishing. So let's get right into it. Once again, you'll have to pardon my drawing skills. So, like I was talking earlier, smallmouth in the summer, they need oxygen, so they need current, but more importantly, they need current that is disturbed, and so that's where, when you get an eddy or a rapid or something that breaks up the surface of the water, that's what really pulls a lot of the oxygenated water into the system. And so, one thing to keep in mind with that, sorry, I don't have a very good tripod here, so bear with me. But one thing to keep in mind with that is that the bass always have to point upstream. So if they're, way over here in the back eddy, they got to point this way. And if they're over here, they're going to be pointing this way. There are places in this diagram where, sure, current is going to be, at a minimal. So, like, there'll be places like on the edge of the seam where, the current kind of balances out between the eddy and the back eddy. And the fish have a little more leeway in, like, which direction they orient. There's certainly going to be places up shallow, where they don't have to really worry about that so much. But one thing to keep in mind is that while these places, this chunk rock and these boulders out in this slack water can be really good fishing in like spring and fall, oftentimes in the heat of summer when that water's really hot, there's just not enough oxygen. And so you might find fish hanging out in the shallows, maybe in the morning, maybe in the evening, but they're going to spend most of their time in this super oxygenated water. One thing to keep in mind is that, your bigger boulders and your chunkier rock tends to be up towards the head of the eddy or the rapid or whatever we're talking about. Obviously, if, you have a fancy boat with a spot lock trolling motor, you can always come at this from a different angle. You can spot lock out here. But for the most part, I have been making this for people who are kind of like myself, who, maybe you enjoy shore fishing, maybe you rock a tin rig like I do. I have just a little 14-foot John boat, but I catch a lot of big summer smallmouth on it. So, if you are a person who has, a metal boat and, you don't want to just drift along, because, like, by and large, most people, they just float along and they just make casts at the shore and they're in the strike zone for, like, 5 seconds at a time. And that is not the ideal way to effectively bass fish in the dog days of summer. So oftentimes, if you're fishing out of a boat, what I would recommend is, come into these eddies and anchor up somewhere where you can get a really good cast into that nice oxygenated water, that seam there. And, some places you don't need to anchor up because, the eddy is wide enough that you can kind of just go about your way. But if you have to, by all means, go for it. You're definitely going to get fewer snags if you're this guy who can either anchor in main water or you have a fancy trolling motor. But that doesn't mean that you can't catch a lot of big fish, from your, little tin boat, without a fancy trolling motor, or even as a shore angler. I've caught loads of 4+ pound smallmouth in the dog days of summer, just shore banging it, and I love it. It's a lot of fun. Shoot, if you were a shore angler, you could even wade out here a little ways and get a better cast on some of these spots that maybe aren't quite as wide. But, going to use this guy as a frame of reference. So you've gone in, you've anchored up, or you've waded all the way out here. And, oops, let me just move my diagram. And, where typically most people would be casting in this shallow stuff, the numbers of fish and the bigger fish have moved out to the current. So, a couple things to keep in mind. One, you are absolutely going to snag more casting into the current and trying to get it down to the bottom. If I cast out at a 90-degree angle going that way, 90 degrees perpendicular to the current, I'm going to have fewer snags, which can be nice, but something to keep in mind is that cast is not going to hit the bottom until it's gone a few feet behind you. And by the time you're actually fishing, because those smallmouth like to be right on the rocks, that bottom has all these little, boulders and rocks and whatnot that they can get away from the current. So by the time I'm in the strike zone, my cast might be all the way down here. Or if I don't have a heavy enough weight, my cast might be all the way, over here, and maybe I never made it to the sweet spot. So something to keep in mind is that that perpendicular cast, it can work and you'll probably get bites down here, but you may not be fishing as effectively. So you gotta play around with your casting angle a little bit. So if you wanted to target this spot right in front of you, what if you cast it upstream at a 45-degree angle, that right there? Well, you absolutely can do that. Something to keep in mind, though, when you do is if you are casting upstream, you are putting yourself at a greater risk of snags, but you're also allowing yourself to have a better swath in the current. Because ultimately, what you're trying to do is cast your bait out in this current and let the current carry your bait along in that sweet spot. So that being said, if you do make that upstream, that 45-degree cast, you might have to pick up some line as the current swings your bait this way. And so you might have to pick up some of that slack line that the current is throwing in the way. Because ultimately we're trying to get the current to create a little bow in our line and just carry it along. But if we have too big of a bow, then it's going to wrap up around a boulder somewhere, and we're going to get snagged. And, if you're fishing effectively, there's no way to avoid snags altogether. But you can absolutely minimize the amount of snags that you get. And, the same goes through for the shore guy. Sometimes the shore guy can wade out here and he can, hit this water that's a little less snaggy and catch a lot of fish, and even big fish. I've absolutely caught big smallmouth in the tailouts of eddies, so they'll be through this whole system, but a lot of times the bigger ones tend to congregate up front here towards the head of it. And oftentimes on a spot, the only access you may have, because, if it's a really big eddy, maybe the only access you have from shore are up here, and then you do have to cast perpendicular and swing it around into this sweet spot, or maybe you do have to cast upstream and snag quite a bit, but that might put you where some of those bigger fish naturally are anyway. So just because you don't have the big fancy boat with the fancy trolling motor doesn't mean you can't fish this stuff really effectively. Like I've said, both from my boat and from shore, I've caught tons of great big old smallmouth. And, here soon I'm going to make some videos about bottom contact baits that, I would be throwing in those kinds of spots. But by and large, that's kind of the gist of it, is that, like, you're either going to cast, perpendicular or upstream and, reel in slack as it's coming your way, and you're just hoping to bounce along the bottom. Every once in a while, you may have to, give your rod, pop it off a rock, or lift your rod tip up over a boulder. You're absolutely going to break stuff off in this stuff, but that's where the fish are in the dog days of summer. You can fish some of this stuff. Oftentimes, the smallest bass are going to be, closest to shore, and if you're trying to catch numbers, that's fine. But in the real heat of summer, those fish need that oxygenated water, and that's where they're really going. So yeah, like I said, in the near future, I'm gonna put out some videos on some bottom contact baits. One thing I forgot to mention that I like to keep in mind. Typically, when I'm river fishing, I go with a little bit heavier line than most people might expect me to. And the reason for that is that I want the current to catch my line really well. So that might look like, on a bait caster, that might be 30 to 40 pound braid and, a 15 or 17 pound leader, because I know that the current's going to catch that and carry it along really well. And on spinning gear, when I'm using a lot lighter lures, that might look like 20 pound braid with like a 12, 10, 12 pound leader. Usually like a 12, maybe even up to a 15 pound leader. But once again, that's to allow the current to carry that along better. Because if I get it stuck on the bottom, usually what ends up happening is, as the current is taking it along, it wedges it in between a rock that otherwise I would not have hit. It puts it in a spot that doesn't really happen without the current. So it's damn near impossible to keep your lure in one particular spot in current. So the best I can do is manage my line to try and give it to the fish optimally. Because like I said before, one, they need this current, but two, they're kind of hanging out in these current breaks, waiting for a meal to swim by. And then they dart out and grab it. So they don't really have a whole lot of time to react on a real prey item. So, how is it any different than hucking a bait out there and bouncing it along through these rocks? They've got to react, or they've got to, pass it by. They don't really have a whole lot of time to make a decision. And that is one advantage to river fishing. But like I said, a guy anchoring up in a John boat can do this just fine. A guy from shore can do this just fine. You're going to lose tackle, and, obviously, if you can anchor out and, outside of the seam, or, use a spot lock out there, you'll probably lose fewer items, but you can fish very effectively being like this guy or even like this guy. So don't be afraid to do that this summer. Don't be afraid to lose some tackle. And here soon I'll have a video up about some bottom contact baits that I like that come through these rocks better than others, and stuff that I really do believe catches a lot of good fish in summer.